So I got to take a drink for this one. I should have got me some alcohol for this subject because this subject is depressing. But we got to talk about it. Kids are being tortured. Let me show you guys something. Kids are being tortured. And it's primarily ones that look like me. And you guys know how we feel at Revolutionary Blackout about the carceral system. How really it should be abolished because most people who are incarcerated are deserving of restorative justice. Really, everybody is worthy of restorative justice. And after seeing this story, it smacked me in the face. So I'm going to show you guys the article first. Oh boy. All right, so this is out of the appeal. Let me see. So it says 133 degrees and no AC. Kids at Angola prison kept in potentially deadly heat. So this is happening in this country. And the fact is that this should not be going on 100 at all. And let's just get into it. With heat indexes in the area regularly hitting triple digits, children incarcerated at Louisiana's Angola prison have been locked in windowless cells for nearly 24 hours a day. One medical expert says the conditions put lives at risk. Let me enlarge this just a little bit so you guys can see it a little bit better. All right. There's children incarcerated on the former death row unit of Louisiana's Angola prison were locked in their cells without air conditioning for several days this month amid scorching summer temperatures, according to a teenager held at the facility. The child, identified by the pseudonym Charles C., said in a statement to his attorney that the kids were only let out of their cells for an 8-minute shower, which they had to take while handcuffed with their ankles shackled. On Monday night, the American Civil Liberties Union and other legal groups submitted statements from young people held at Angola to the U.S. District Court for the Middle District of Louisiana. The plaintiffs asked the court to order state officials to immediately move all kids out of the unit and to cease transfers into the unit. With heat indexes in the surrounding area reaching as high as 133 degrees this month, a medical expert for the plaintiffs warned the court that the conditions could be fatal. Dr. Susie Asalo said, "I would not dare to keep my dog in these conditions for fear of my dog dying." This is a medical expert for the plaintiffs. It has been dangerously hot in Angola so far this summer, confining children for all or most of the day to concrete and cement buildings without air conditioning is too foolhardily and perilous. You know, it's interesting. You get a lot of people who say, we got to protect the kids. We got to protect our kids. What about them? What about the news stories about police officers sexually assaulting teenage boys while stopping and frisking them? But they look like me, so it doesn't matter. Confining them to solitary confinement and putting them in cinder block ovens. That's torture. I'm going to read the rest of the article, but I just want to share with you guys why I can so confidently say that is torture. Solitary confinement is a human rights violation. The United Nations Committee Against Torture cited the excessive use of solitary confinement in the United States as a violation of the Convention Against Torture in 2014. Solitary confinement is torture. It should not be done to anyone. And yet, in this country, we're even doing it to children. The system, it is not, things like this are not a bug, it is a feature of the system. Let me share it with you guys, and I'll go over more of the gory details, but this is what's happening in Louisiana. By the way, this prison is also called the Alcatraz of the South.
In one of the most infamous prisons in the country.
We pray that you touch the hearts of these people to not send these kids to Angola and to try to help these kids so they can have a better life. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
We're in Baton Rouge, Louisiana at the state capitol with an organization called Family and Friends of Louisiana's Incarcerated Children. And they're about to crash a governor's meeting to voice their concerns about kids in Angola prison.
Louisiana is home to one of the nation's most notorious juvenile justice systems. After a series of high-profile escapes, suicides, and acts of violence in youth facilities, Governor John Bel Edwards announced plans to move several children to Angola, a maximum security prison for adults.
First of all, by the way, I love when Black women say it because it has such a great ring to it. First of all, it rolls off the tongue better for them than it does for me. But anyways, question by Bill Bradley. Great question. Why are minors being held in a maximum security facility? What is wrong with people in this nation? It's an adult prison. They segregate out the minors, but why are minors there in the first place? Exactly. My question is, why in the hell would we put kids in a maximum security prison? Why are they there in the first place? They're kids. Does that make any sense to anybody? Let's continue.
Excuse me, can I ask Governor? Can I ask you a question? He's going around the other way. I mean, we wanted to meet with the governor's office and he went out the back door.
The state says the move is about keeping children.
By the way, the governor is a Democrat. So just so anybody realizes, the Democrats and Republicans are all one party. And if they're willing to do this to our youth, they're no better. Remember, Joe Biden wrote the 94 crime bill. a Democrat. Let's continue.
Children safe. But the protesters believe it's just the latest example of a system more geared towards punishing children than helping them.
No justice! No peace! No justice! No peace! No peace in Angola! No kids in Angola! No kids in Angola! Whose kids? Our kids! Whose kids? Our kids! Whose kids? Our kids!
Every young person that lives in Louisiana knows that this is the worst place ever.
Gina Womack runs Families and Friends of Louisiana's Incarcerated Children.
The governor stated that this was going to be a temporary transitional unit until they could stabilize the other facilities, and it was in the best interest of these young people who were supposedly wreaking havoc on some of the other young people, and it was a way to keep them safe and the other youth safe.
Now, as I understand, Angola was built for some of the toughest, hardened, grown criminals. The governor is saying that they're now going to house young teenagers there.
They are housing, and they are in a death row facility.
Louisiana has a long track record of treating juvenile offenders like adults. Even before the decision to move children to Angola, the state regularly subjected them to solitary confinement and ignored reports of abuse from officers at juvenile facilities.
Remember, everybody, solitary confinement is torture. Remember, every single time, I want you guys to, in your minds, whenever you hear solitary confinement, or they'll try to call it by another name, but when they house kids in a facility and keep them separate for hours and hours on end without human contact, that's solitary confinement. No matter what they say, the process is still the same, right? If it walks like a duck, talks like a duck, and quacks like a duck, then guess what? It's a duck. So guess what? It's solitary confinement. And every single time you hear the word solitary confinement, I want you to remember the word torture. That's what it is. Torture. So when they say they're putting kids in solitary confinement, just put in your mind, I want you to remember this. They're torturing our kids. They're torturing our kids. Keep that in mind whenever you hear this. This is what the state is doing. Let's keep going.
The juvenile justice system, the way it was designed, is supposed to be to help these kids. It's supposed to be like a social welfare kind of setup. It's not supposed to be punishment, because the law recognizes that a kid is different. And if a kid does something wrong, the kid needs help, not punishment.
Beth Schwartzapfel has covered the Louisiana justice system for the Marshall Project, including revealing the experience of children held in solitary confinement.
From torture.
From the perspective of the juvenile offenders, like at this point, what are the conditions that they're forced to live in?
They were in these cinder block rooms there were these solid steel doors with a tiny slot where they would pass the food through, and they were held in there for 24 hours a day. What's wild is they had these light fixtures in the ceiling, and they had like sprinklers. The kids were so stir crazy and bored and frustrated that they took apart the light fixtures and the sprinklers, and they started using the pieces to dig holes in the wall so that they could climb through the cells to see one another and talk to one another. And
did you hear that? They're literally breaking apart pieces of the cell in order to just interact with each other. Humans are a social species. What happens when you cut a human off from contact? We can die. This is how important social contact amongst us is important. They're literally going through walls. Look at this. Look at this. Look at that. Breaking through brick walls just to hang out and socialize. That's it. They're not even trying to get out of the prison. They're just trying to socialize. And you mean to tell me that that's not being tortured? That is torture. This is wicked, man. Wicked.
So that they could climb through the cells to see one another and talk to one another. And the state would come in, replace the light fixtures, the same thing would happen again. So then the state responded by removing the lights. And then the kids started taking their beds apart and using the pieces from their bed to dig holes. And so they took away the beds. So for some of these kids, it was like literally a mattress on a concrete floor in the dark. So,
Right.
you know, it's not like an adult serving a life sentence. Not that that makes it okay.
Right.
But, you know, there are going to be adults, grown adults, who are going to go into society.
And you're sending them from an environment which is just a black box.
It's damaging. I mean, it's a black box literally and figuratively, right? You're damaging them. You are sending them out into the world with more problems than they came in.
I honestly do think that this is the intention. Putting them in there so that they're so problematic because of the trauma that they are inducing upon them, that it radicalizes them to be dangerous to society, so that when they get released, they can have a recidivism and bring them back. I think, honestly, this is intentional in order to keep the recidivism rates higher, so that they continuously come back over and over and over. And so then they also influence, so that they can keep them and influence others to keep coming back into the system. Why? Because we all know that the 13th Amendment did not fully abolish slavery. It keeps slavery within our carceral system. So then once they become adults and they're put in prison, they can become the new age slaves in our carceral system, which is being used by corporations in this country. It is a vicious cycle that this government, and by government, I mean the entire United States, is doing against our kids. I want you to put that in your mind. Our kids, ours. These aren't some kids. These are our kids. This is our blood. This is our community. And I'm not just talking about black people, baby. I'm talking about everybody. Black people, white people, black kids are your kids too. Latinos, black kids are your kids too. Asians, black kids are your kids too. Just like white, Asian, black, disabled, queer, they're all my kids. Just like that, they're your kids too, because we're all part of one another. Every single one of us. Your kids are my kids and my kids are your kids, because ultimately we are all one. And so I want you to regain your sense of outrage while you're watching this, because this is what matters. Because if they're doing it to them, by extension, they're doing it to you. Let's continue.
Solitary confinement don't do nothing but like it make it deteriorate, especially if you a juvenile. Around that time, everything based off like influence and what you intaking. So however you gonna be or what you trying to transform into gonna be based off what you learning at that time. And if you in solitary confinement, you can't learn nothing but the way the bricks look around you.
Darren Dew and D'Angelo Davis both testified in April of 2022 at a hearing for HB 746, a bill inspired in part by Beth's reporting that would limit solitary confinement for children.
When you have brains developing, brains and hearts developing and you put them in a torturous situation, you are breaking people. You're breaking those young minds. You're breaking them. You're harming them. And the state knows this. There are too many psychologists, child psychologists, that have already expressed this. They know this. It's not like, oh, I'm unaware. No, they're aware. And that's the more nefarious part of this, is that they are aware. It's on purpose.
How old were you when you got incarcerated?
14.
I was 15.
14? 15? Tell me about the facilities and what it was like for you all to experience that.
The conditions of the buildings, it looked like they've been there for over 100 years. That's the worst thing ever, the living conditions. Mold in the shower and shit like that.
And rats and shit. Like, yeah, have a whole dorm, like, making a juice out of rats being in the dorm. You become, like, adapted to that type of stuff. Like, you ain't around nothing but other males all day. So it's like buku aggression and testosterone in the dorm. So no matter how you look at it, you're going to be, like, kind of developing into what's around you.
Like, they took the years away that was supposed to teach us how to grow up and be a man and replaced it with straight violence.
What effect does...
You heard what he said? Let's go back. Because the thing is that you can teach young boys how to be men, but that doesn't mean that you teach them to be violent. But the system will force that upon them. Let's continue. Let's go back and hear what he said.
Like, they took the years away that was supposed to teach us how to grow up and be a man and replaced it with straight violence.
Like I said, they want them to be violent so that when they go back out, then they rearrest them again, put them back into the system, place them into a prison that does slave labor, so then they can have more slaves. And then this perpetuates the stereotype that black men are violent. And especially when you look at people like me, especially those of us who are darker skinned, our skin color is seen as a weapon. We're seen as inherently violent. And then they target young black boys constantly, all the time, because it is easier. And then society looks at us as violent already inherently. And because they do that, then guess what? There's less sympathy for us. And then it's because there's less sympathy, they don't really care if we're suffering. They don't even care about the torture. And this actually actively puts other racial groups' mind into the point where they start to accept the notion of us being enslaved again.
What effect does solitary confinement have on you as a person?
Man, solitary confinement made me, they're kind of like antisocial now. Like, I don't like people now. Like, man, I got major anxiety now. I had to get drunk when I go out there or something just to loosen up a little bit to enjoy myself. And it wasn't like that before jail.
So now he has to engage in substance abuse in order to just deal with society. That young man is damaged because the state damaged him. Instead of giving him empathy, they gave him malice. And they damaged him. They damaged his mind and his heart. Poor boy.
The bill limiting juvenile solitary was signed into law last June, but hope for any real reform was short-lived.
John Bel Edwards, a Democrat, y'all. A Democrat. Don't let nobody tell you anything different regarding the parties. They are one party. They don't care about us. A Democrat.
The planned transfer of young people to Angola was announced soon after. The Louisiana governor and Office of Juvenile Justice didn't respond to several requests for comment. So how did we go from this victory after your reporting to kids being locked up on former death row in Angola prison?
I think we got from A to B because, you know, you can make a law that says that you can't hold kids in solitary confinement for more than 24 hours at a time, right? Which is what the law says. That doesn't address any of the underlying issues, right? Like, why is the state holding kids in solitary confinement? Because these kids are seriously troubled and need a tremendous amount of help that the state does not have the resources to provide.
First of all, the state could have resources to provide, but the thing is that the state doesn't do it because the state doesn't want to. Because those resources are withheld because the resources go to the very wealthy instead of the people who actually need it. Ultimately, when you look at all these issues, it always goes down to class. Always, 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 it goes down to class. And that's the problem. And when people sit here and go, oh, well, they're just violent. They need, why are they, wait, hold up. Why were they violent in the first place? Ask that question. You see, the thing about the system is they always want to treat the symptoms and never the actual underlying cause. Could it possibly be that the underlying cause could be poverty, right? Some of these kids probably have parents that are working day in and day out just to survive, and they don't actually have their parents actively in their lives because their parents are too busy working just to keep a roof over their head. What about making sure they just have a roof over their head, irregardless? What about making sure they have food in their bellies, irregardless of money? Make sure they have health care, including mental health care. Resources that actually allow them to see counselors and psychiatrists and psychologists. But no, we don't have money for that. But you have money to give subsidies to fossil fuel companies. You have money to give tax breaks to these rich people who curb the tax system. You have money for that. You have money to send to Nazis in Ukraine. You have money to send to the apartheid state of Israel? $3 billion a year? You have money for that. But you don't got money for people who look like me. What? You don't have money to give universal health care. 6 million vacant homes in this country. We could literally house all the homeless. We could literally end poverty in this country today. So then kids won't have to worry about, things like this. They won't have to have PTSD. We can literally change the scope and the trajectory of this country, but the super rich won't get extra money.
That is still true.
The reason that's stated for sending juveniles to Angola prison is that it's a temporary solution for those who have been very disruptive and violent towards staff members.
How long though? Because if that's the case, solitary confinement is a temporary solution. You know what I'm saying? But they was abusing it. They always.
it should have never been used in the first place. So I'm going to move on a little bit. And this part is, God.
An author and lawyer whose work helped reduce life sentences for kids. Did a lot of work arguing before the Supreme Court that's been so impactful. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. We were really thrilled when the Supreme Court declared that mandatory life without parole sentences for all children are unconstitutional. And, you know, we've been going around the country representing young people who had those sentences.
Yeah.
When I go places, there are now about 1,000 people who were told they were going to die in prison with life without parole, who have not only had their sentences reduced, but have been released. And one of the joys of my career is I go places and I meet people and they'll come up to me and say, hey man, I'm one of your guys. And you know, to see them doing well and doing flourishing, it's just such a powerful statement about how wrong it was to ever say to some child that you're not fit. You know, you're fit only to die in prison.
You probably don't know, but I'm one of your guys.
Oh, beautiful.
Yeah, I was sentenced to 27 and a third years to life.
Yeah.
And during my incarceration, I went from a GED to a master's degree.
Yeah.
So I was a fit candidate for parole.
Yeah.
But when I made it to the parole board, I was denied. So I filed a lawsuit using your case, stating that by denying me parole, it's tantamount to giving me life without parole. Did you ever intend that case having that kind of usage?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I think part of what I've been interested in is just pushing back against this idea that became very popular in the 80s, where you had criminologists going around to legislatures arguing that some children aren't children, that some kids aren't kids. They look like kids and they talk like kids. But these folks argued that they weren't kids, and they came up with that term. They said these are, quote, super predators. And
does that sound familiar to you? Does that sound familiar to any of you? Hello, Hillary Rodham Clinton. Hello, Joe Biden. Calling us super predators. Saying that even though we look, act, talk, and are the same age as kids, we're not kids. This has been a problem in the Black community for forever. That when you're Black, even when you're a child, you're seen as an adult because you're seen as threatening. This is why Tamir Rice was murdered even though he was only 12 years old. They even considered him a man while he was playing with a toy gun, colorful toy gun, in a park. Yep. Sensei Reed looks like a fucking baby. Baby face. Still got murdered. So this is something that happens all the time. This is why when I look at like my nephews, I'm like, keep your nose clean. Don't stay out too late. I've had to have this talk with my nephews. Don't stay out too late. And be very careful about police. Because you may be 14, 15, 16 years old, but to them, you're a grown-ass man. And your skin is seen as a dangerous weapon. And this is something that happens to us all the time. And remember, this is due to Black people being listed as second-class citizens in this country. It always goes back to class. Remember that.
That demonizing label was used to create all of these horrific policies. It's been heartbreaking because that's where the schoolhouse to jailhouse pipeline was constructed, and fear and anger that was behind that rhetoric just caused us to look away. And I've always believed that all children are children, and you don't judge a society and its commitment to children by looking at how well it treats talented kids and gifted kids and privileged kids. A society's commitment to children has to be judged by how we're treating kids that have fallen down, kids that are struggling, kids that are poor, kids that have been abused, kids in detention facilities. I mean, I think generally the idea of just saying to someone, you should die in prison is a flawed idea.
So yeah, I'm not going to play the entire video, but this was deep. And the thing is that this is what our kids are going through in this country. And just to put a finer point on this, let me share this also with you guys. It says the OJJ policy, which is what is it called again? I forgot. Office of Juvenile Justice. Sorry. It says the OJJ policy, Office of Juvenile Justice policy, states that children can be sent to Angola from other facilities for any number of reasons, including committing certain acts of violence against a staff member or possessing marijuana. It says even kids determined to have a serious mental illness or significant developmental disabilities can be transferred to a unit. This is how we treat kids with mental disabilities. So even if you're a kid and you have a mental disability or an intellectual disability, this is how they treat them. Instead of using healthcare to treat them, they use punishment to treat them. And like I said, if they're going to do it to us, they're going to do it to you. So make sure to wise up. Charles C. was hospitalized at 10 years old and diagnosed with schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and ADHD, according to previous statements submitted to the court. He was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder after being shot at age 13 and has been hospitalized several times for mental health crises. That means that this is how we treat the disabled in this country. Living in poverty is also a source of PTSD among many of us. It's called a disease of despair. And some of us try to get out of it by doing illegal things in order to get out of that situation. That's the state of the human condition in this country. And even when we go by illegal means to get out of it, because it's made illegal or because we have never been given the resources in order to change our lives or to have our lives in a good base, then guess what? We end up violating the law just to survive. And then because we have to violate the law just to survive, well, then that's illegal. So therefore, we're put into the carceral system and subject to torture. We can't win for losing. We can't. It says, in addition to the unbearable heat, Charles reported that a staff member had thrown him against the wall, which made him bleed. He said he'd been denied access to educational programs and is often hungry because he doesn't have enough food. Charles says, I am close to getting my HISET high school diploma, and it makes me sad I can't earn it. They keep promising that they'll give me education, but won't. When Utter met with Charles at Angola earlier this month, Utter told the Appeal that the teenager appeared exhausted. Though the room was air-conditioned, unlike the cells, Utter said it was still uncomfortably hot. Charles told him that the heat made it difficult to sleep. He literally had his head down on his knees almost the entire time we spoke. It was very difficult for him to communicate because he was so tired. After the visit, Utter said he returned to his car and saw that the temperature outside had reached nearly 100 degrees. They have a fan and are supposed to give us ice and water, but only provide it about half the time. I am often thirsty. When the power goes out, we don't even have the fan. The day before Utter's visit, Charles reported that staffers had let him and other kids out for 2 hours of recreation, during which the time they were handcuffed and their ankles shackled. No ball is provided, so we just sit there. Another teenager at the facility, identified by the pseudonym Daniel D., said that in his statement to the court that when he arrived at Angola, he was locked alone in his cell for 3 days and not allowed out except to shower. Since then, he's been confined to his cell every day from 5 p.m. to 8 a.m. Like Charles, he reported that there was no air conditioning in his housing unit and that they don't even have working fans when the power goes out. He said that the food is so atrocious that at one point he only ate 3 meals in 10 days. He buys items from the commissary to sustain himself. By the way, just so that anybody realizes, if you've had family that was incarcerated, do you know how expensive it is to keep money on their books so they can get food from the commissary? Do you know how expensive that is? Especially to many families like mine who are poor or working poor, who can't afford to really put money on people's books all the time. So they're subject to either having to eat unedible food or nothing at all. So guess what? They starve. It is not unusual to see somebody go into incarceration, chubby like me, and then come out like a stick because they can't eat properly. They don't have proper nutrition in there. Anybody who knows anybody's been incarcerated, I knew a few. Just to even communicate with them on the phone is expensive because they charge you to call to the jail or prison. Trust me, I have family members that have to go through that. I know. Having to put $25, $30, $40, $50 just for the phone calls for the month. And then you only get maybe about 4 or 5 calls out of it. Yes, I understand how this rolls. I know how this goes. So there's a petition that's going around to stop this torturous practice in Louisiana. And I want to share this petition. And if you guys have not, please circulate this video, share it on social media, like the stream if you guys have not already, so that this can get pushed out into the algorithm. This is the petition. It says, kids don't belong in America's worst prison. We should not have children in prisons, period. We shouldn't really have people in these prisons, to be honest with you, because this is a crime against humanity. Right now, it's over 3,000 signatures. What's needed is 4,000. Share this and sign it and share, please, if you can, because this does not need to be. This should not be happening in the richest country in the history of the world, because this is sick, right? So please share. Kids do not belong in these prisons, period. End of story. It should not be happening. And anybody who who says otherwise, they are making an excuse for torture. You are making an excuse. And by the way, let this shit happen to a little white kid. I'm sorry that way, but let this happen to a little white kid, and there will be outrage. I'm sure it does happen to some little white kids. I'm sure it does. This should not be happening. And this is happening on purpose. Do not let anybody manipulate you into thinking, oh, well, this, they shouldn't, they should have just, they did the crime, they should do the time, blah, 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 blah. No. Solitary confinement is a human rights violation. The United Nations Committee Against Torture cited the excessive use of solitary confinement in the United States as a violation of the Conventions Against Torture in 2014. They should not be held like that, and they should not even be put into a maximum security prison because they are little kids. So, please make sure to like the stream and share it far and wide so that people are no longer subject to this type of treatment. That's why I put in the title, Tortured in America, because it is literal torture. And then on top of being in solitary confinement, on top of all that, they're also subject to being cooked in a concrete oven. $133 degrees? That was the temperature in Death Valley. What was it, 2 weeks ago? It reached record temperatures of 133 degrees. A human can die at 120. Humans die at that temperature. You're killing them. That's murder. It's horrible. It's just horrible. Please share.